Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at succession for your A-level biology. So there are lots of different parts involved in this. What needs to happen in order for succession to be able to take place? If you want to make sure that you remembered everything that you need to for your A-level exam, then over on the website there's a set of flashcards, set of questions just waiting for you.
So in this video, we're going to look at succession. So succession is the process which changes the physical and chemical conditions as well as the species that live in a particular environment over time. So in any environment, plants and animals in the environment change over long periods of time, but also they have direct effects on both the abiotic conditions as well, the chemical and the physical composition of the habitat. So succession takes place because through the process of living, growing, reproducing and dying, organisms are constantly interacting with their environment and affect the environment, and they actually change the area and the habitat around them. It takes place in a series of predictable stages because it's a directional process. So it goes from what we call like bare rock or the pioneer stage all the way through to what we call the climax community. And we'll look at those steps and sort of you need to be able to describe what happens in each of those steps. And more importantly, describe how that first step changes things in order to allow the second step to occur. Because it's through the biotic change of conditions, and that is being affected by the abiotic change in conditions, that each species starts adapting to that specific set of conditions, and then if they change the conditions, they're no longer adapted to those anymore, and a new species will come in and outcompete that species because they are better adapted to those new conditions, and so on and so on, and that keeps happening over and over again. So by growing and surviving and being adapted to a certain condition, they then do really, really well and succeed. They actually change the abiotic conditions because of them being there, or the biotic conditions, and so then they create a new set of environmental conditions that they're no longer as adapted to as when they started, and so then another species come in and takes over and then changes things further. Mostly we're going to be looking at changes in plant species for these examples, and a lot of it is focused around the UK. But changes in the animal species happen because of those changes in plant species. So if we think about it, we've got the more different plant species we have, the more sources of food you have, the more habitats you have, the more shelter, the more kind of shade, for example, the more leaf litter, because if you've got more plants with more leaves, dropping leaves, that makes leaf litter on the ground. All of those things mean that we're providing more of those options and environments for animals to live in. More food, more habitat, more shelter. So we increase biodiversity. By increasing the plant number and different plant species, that increases biodiversity. And then because you've got all of those lots of different plants as well, that further increases biodiversity because it encourages more and different animal species to live there. So by doing that and starting off with the plant species and building that up, it creates the environment to be less hostile. So it takes the environment that's quite harsh with very few plant species, very little water, very exposed to the elements, and it turns it into what we're used to seeing with things like rainforests and large, lush green forests where there's all different and hundreds of different species of plants and animals all thriving together. And because it does that, because it makes that environment less hostile, less hard to live in, and promotes growth of new species. So that's what succession does. It increases biodiversity by changing the environment, making it less hostile, abiotic conditions so that more species can live there, and therefore improving the biotic conditions, which means even more species can live there. So although we're going to be focusing mostly on plants and mostly on quite a narrow example of British succession, then you've got to think about how this happens in all the different places and all the different environments and habitats around the world, and mainly thinking about the fact that animals obviously then follow this succession as well. So we're not just talking about plants normally, there'll be animals going along with each of these stages that are supported by these different plant species. So there's two types of succession, primary and secondary. So we're going to have a look at both, and then we're going to have a look at how humans can have an impact on succession. Okay, so let's go through this then. So primary succession is our first example. It happens on land that is newly formed or exposed where there is no soil. So often this is from something like a glacier retreat. So when the ice melts or a glacier is moving slowly over time, because they do move and sort of slide, what they leave behind is what's often called a scree slope. So it's bare, exposed rock that hasn't been exposed because it's been trapped under the ice. And then obviously once the ice retreats and it is then exposed to all of the different elements, and then also obviously plant species can start to colonize it. So seeds and spores blow on the wind and they're going to land on this bare rock surface and they're going to begin to colonize it. The conditions are very hostile, so it's going to potentially be very exposed. There's going to be high light intensity. There's going to be little water because it's like dry, bare rock and there's nowhere for the water to sit and be contained. So it could be, when we say exposed, it could be very windy, for example. So you've got all of these kind of harsh, hostile abiotic conditions that mean only certain species could actually grow here. So even if some other seeds were blown over at the time, only some species like lichens, for example, would actually be able to colonize and start to grow on this bare rock face. Then we get our pioneer species proper. So lichens are a pioneer species, they're one example. And then we're going to get some of our other lichens as well, but also some small plants, annual plants. So that means they live for a year. They don't come back each year, they just kind of live for one season, grow and then die. So that means their life cycle is quite short, and so they're going to die and they'll be decomposed by microorganisms through the process of decay that we know, because microorganisms would be able to survive here, especially if they have material to break down, which is what they're going to have when these plants die. And so that starts to create a layer of soil on top of the bare rock. So the breakdown means it's going to release some nutrients, and we get what is called a humus, which is basically the soil that's on top of the rock, but it's a very thin layer at the moment. The new organisms are then able to come in. So the pioneer species have started to create this even better, kind of thicker layer of soil. And so what they're able to do is they've made the conditions less hostile, less harsh, because there's more soil, which means there's more nutrients. Also, there's soil for roots to grow into, which plants need to be stable. There's going to be water that's going to be able to be trapped in between those soil particles. So that means that they've got access to more water and therefore more of them can grow. So we get this more of them growing and therefore more of them dying. And if more of them die and decay, then we get an even deeper layer of soil with even more nutrients in it. So we're making the conditions even better for other plants to come along and colonize. So now we get to a point where there's enough soil that we can actually have some shrubs and some small trees appear, and they are sometimes shade intolerant, so they're used to having a lot of light, because there'll still be a lot of light if they're quite small and they're all on the same kind of height level. They will become what we call the dominant species. So the dominant species is always the species that's having the most change and the most effect on the environment. But biodiversity has increased. So we're increasing our biodiversity as we go along, because we're increasing the amount of different plant species that can live there. And remember, that's also having an effect on the number of different animal species that can live there as well. And then lastly, we get to our climax community. So the climax community is the greatest and most biodiverse community that this habitat can now support. So we will have a mixture of species, but mostly we're talking about large trees and then some small shrubs that can cope living underneath them in the shade that they're creating. And we've got this kind of, normally we've got oak, for example, oak forest, ash forest that we're going to have in the UK is what our normal climax community would look like. So if all land was just left to go through this process of succession, we'd have forest of some kind covering most of the UK. And that's what it would have looked like sort of back in the early times before humans had really colonised a lot of the land and sort of started to chop down trees and things like that. So then trees and big trees become the dominant species because they are now the ones that are having the most effect on the environment. But it stops there. So it doesn't change anymore. It becomes a stable community, a stable environment. So we don't get much change. It would be like that for hundreds and hundreds of years after that point. It has taken hundreds of years to get to this point. This does not happen overnight. This takes a very long time to occur. And then when we get to that climax community, then that would be very stable and it wouldn't change. So we talked about which species become the dominant species as we move through that process of succession, and it's because they're changing the abiotic conditions the most, and the main thing is they're making it more suitable or less hostile for the next species to grow. So we need to have a think about some examples. Don't necessarily need to know all these examples off the top of your head, although realistically for pioneer species, really we should know lichens. But it's also thinking about how are they actually changing? How are they improving the abiotic conditions? How are they making it less hostile and more suitable for the next species? That's the point you would have to get into your long answer if you were talking about succession. So it would be going through the stages, talking about pioneer species, maybe give an example, explain how it makes it more hospitable for the next species, then say what the next species would be, say about the increasing in the soil, and then moving on to, what would the next species potentially be, and how would that make it better for the next species after? Okay, now how come trees can come? And that's the kind of answer you would need to give. So here's some kind of walkthrough of each stage and sort of talking about how they actually change that abiotic conditions. So the pioneer species, we said lichens. The reason lichens are good at being a pioneer species is because they secrete acids. So they erode the rocks, the bare rock face, and start to release some of those minerals and also break up the surface of that rock, which increases little cracks and crevices that the seeds are then going to potentially come and be able to sit in. Mosses also is sort of the next stage of pioneer species. They have very, very small roots and they're very good at retaining moisture. So then they are able to grow in very, very little amounts of soil. Then we have marram grass. So this is a specific example of sand dunes. So sand dunes are an example of where succession can happen because obviously bare sand is the same as bare rock. There are no plant species there. So marram grass is normally one of the first pioneer species to colonise sand dunes. And they can do that because they have very long roots that reach right down. It means they can get some water, but they can also get through the sand, hold on in the slidey kind of sand environment they've got. How do these pioneer species change? Well, as we said, they release minerals from the rocks. They create soil. So most of the main thing to say is that they decompose when they die and they form this first layer of very thin basic soil, which starts trapping water and so therefore increases water availability and increases some nutrients for the next species. So the next kind of intermediate stage, what could we have? Well, we can have grasses, we can have ferns, we can have small flowering plants. Then we've got things like sand sedge, which is the next stage in a sand dune example. How are they going to change the abiotic conditions? Well, they create a deeper, richer soil when they die, adding even more nutrients and therefore trapping also even more water and moisture. They also, some of these species can then start associating with nitrogen-fixing bacteria or mycorrhizal fungi as well, and that increases the concentration of available nitrates and phosphates if we're talking about mycorrhizal fungi. These are mostly talking about how we're making conditions favourable for the next set of species, because obviously most plants that will associate with nitrogen-fixing bacteria are able to survive in low nitrogen soil conditions. So then, as we were saying before, if then the soil becomes quite rich in nitrogen, they're not going to be as adapted. When other species come, once the nitrogen is there, they will outcompete them. It can also do the opposite, and sand sedge, for example, can actually make the conditions more hostile for the species before. So the marram grass will die out or not be able to be as successful, and the sand sedge is therefore outcompeting it because it actually stabilises the soil and stabilises the sand, and marram grass needs the sand to shift and move in order to grow effectively. So there's kind of two competing sort of ideas here. One is that obviously these plants are making the conditions better, and so more plants are going to be able to come and grow here, but they're also potentially outcompeting the plants before or preventing them from staying. And so we see this disappearing of the marram grass on the sand dunes if sand sedge is present, because those conditions are no longer how the marram grass likes to be able to grow. And then lastly, we have the climax community. So normally, as I said, these are bigger organisms, big trees, big shrubs. In the UK, things like oak, birch, ash are kind of our normal trees for a climax community. In a deciduous forest, in a coniferous forest, the tree species would be different if we were in a colder climate. So this is the other thing you have to think about, is that obviously the climax community is going to look very different depending on what the actual climate is like in all of your different examples. So like I said, if we had like a more northern Scottish Highland kind of snowy cold general temperature, then that climax community is going to be more coniferous forest, so kind of trees with pine trees and needles and spruce and all of that, rather than big broadleaf trees like oak and birch, which will be more used to be seeing in sort of like the southern England. Same as if you're looking at a climax community in Antarctica, or if you're looking at a climax community in the desert, like on the sand dunes. They're not going to get giant oak trees on the sand dunes. Their climax community will be small shrubs of some kind. Okay, so that's something to think about when if you're given any examples, any data or a description or pictures or something like that in the exam. You'll need to kind of adapt this succession story to what they've given you in terms of the species that are present. How do they change the abiotic conditions? Well, this is sort of moving from the late intermediate stage into the climax community. They're going to do things like create shade, which can stabilise temperature because it means that it'll be cooler for some of the plants underneath. They can also decrease light intensity, but that makes it a prime environment for things like shade-tolerant plants. They can trap air underneath canopy layers, and that increases humidity, which obviously is good for some plants because they like a humid environment. They can reduce the wind exposure, so you're less exposed, you're less likely to blow over. All of it also increasing biodiversity because they act as shelter and food sources. There are some animals that only live in trees or up in trees. They wouldn't move around on the ground. So you need a big canopy of trees that they can jump from tree to tree without going on the floor. And then also increases the leaf litter. So the more trees and shrubs you have, falling leaves, especially if they're losing them in sort of autumn and stuff like that, they're going to then collect on the ground, which creates leaf litter, which some organisms live in. Also, some organisms feed off of. So think about all the fungus and the microorganisms that feed off of all of this detritus. It also increases the depth and the nutrient content in soil, and again, increases the water content and things like that. So that's how we get from sort of just no soil, and how are these abiotic conditions being changed every single time with these new communities that are coming up? How is it improving it for the next one, allowing those new species to colonise? Okay, so secondary succession happens when plants are removed, but soil is still present. So it occurs in the same way. It's just that the start is different. We're not starting with bare rock. We're starting with soil, and quite a lot of soil. What we've done is just remove the entire top layer of plants, so everything above ground is gone. Normally, after a forest fire, so everything gets burned, often that means that there's still seeds in the soil, and some species actually need fire, for example, to regenerate and for those seeds to germinate in the heat. And it actually is one of those kind of things that sometimes fires, forest fires, bush fires, are necessary in order to kind of regenerate the land and let this secondary succession start again from scratch. Or it could be from deforestation, so literally just mowing down and chopping down all of the large trees and shrubs and removing them. So we've just got kind of bare soil, but there is soil. So we don't have to start back with our lichens. So our pioneer species are actually kind of going to be the grasses and those small plants, flowering plants and shrubs at the start, which is normally sort of part way through the end of the pioneer stage or the start of the intermediate phase of primary succession. After that, it happens in exactly the same way, and it can occur, like the fire or the deforesting or the digging up of cutting down, whatever it is, can occur any stage of normal succession after the pioneer stage. It could be the climax community gets cut down or ruined by a fire. It could be an intermediate stage, as long as there's plants there and soil there to have been removed. So there is soil present and nutrients present, so we don't need to create soil, and so we start from sort of grasses. It can be forced, so secondary succession can be forced through human action, so we can deliberately burn areas of vegetation to remove them and let this recovery process start to try and prevent a climax community from being created, or if we want it to go back to being sort of a pioneer species community, and we'll look at why we might do that on the next slide.
Human impact on succession. This is sometimes known as deflected succession.
So sometimes humans do not want succession to occur on various areas of land or habitat, usually because we're trying to conserve a species that's not part of the climax community. So if it's a pioneer species or a few pioneer species, some of those small grasses or small flowering plants, and we're trying to preserve them, and we know that if we let succession continue to a climax community, they wouldn't be there. They'd been outcompeted and been lost. So it could be that we want to do that, or it could be wanting to maintain environment at a particular stage for an animal species, for example. So if we know that there is an animal that particularly thrives in a certain stage of succession, but not the climax community, then we can use techniques to try and maintain it at partway through succession and stop that climax community from forming. So mostly these are techniques which prevent larger species from growing, and when you can do that, you prevent succession from becoming the climax community, and what we call it is a plagioclimax instead. So we're kind of artificially suspending succession, and we're maintaining this kind of false climax community somewhere in the middle. So how do we do that? What are the methods we could use? So controlled burning, as I said, so literally using sort of a flamethrower-esque kind of style where literally people do it either attached to a vehicle or do it by hand and burning certain areas, but it's controlled, so it's not just left to run wild like a forest fire. You burn a set area and then sort of create a barrier to stop that fire from burning further outside the area you want, or you put the fire out as you go and make sure that it doesn't spread. Grazing herbivores, so sheep, goats or cattle, something that's going to keep grasses and everything in check and kind of chew them and keep that biodiversity at a set level. Often it does decrease biodiversity because they are keeping the grasses quite short, preventing them from seeding, and we're sort of stopping that next layer past kind of short meadow sort of like communities from developing any further. The same if you mow it. So if you mow, if you know this, if you mow a lawn, you're keeping that lawn quite short. It's going to have a couple of species of grass, but it's not going to let any of those wild flowers or anything pop up. Those seeds will just be cut quite short. You won't get any of that nice different flowers and different seeding happen. So mowing is another sort of technique. If you let it go wild, you can get all those other different species, so you're keeping the biodiversity quite low. Those two may not be for a conservation reason. Those two may be because you need to graze your sheep, goats or cattle somewhere, and you need somewhere for them to eat and go out in the day. And again, you might be mowing the lawn or mowing an area like verges around roads and things like that for safety reasons, or because that is what you've been tasked to do. And so they may not be for conservation reasons, they may be for aesthetic reasons or for agricultural reasons. And finally, coppicing trees. So willow is a good example of this. We're going to talk about it in the next video when we look at conservation, because it's a way of sustainably managing timber forests as well. But chopping trees down to a stump height and then allowing them to grow kind of thin branches and twigs from the stump, rather than letting them to grow really, really tall and creating this dense, thick forest with a big canopy up high. Cutting them at the stump at a certain age and letting them regrow kind of really thin, open branches that allow more light in. It allows kind of more light to reach the ground, and so various other plant species will be able to grow that are kind of shade intolerant or wouldn't be able to grow or would be outcompeted under the big canopy of large trees.
Also, the use of fertilisers or herbicides can also be considered a way of deflecting succession. So this idea of either killing certain plants, and herbicides can be certain plants only that are killed rather than just everything blanket. And also fertilisers, so again, if you fertilise the soil, you are going to be potentially supporting certain species rather than others, and some might need it to be low in a certain nutrient, and you can obviously favour certain species this way.
An example or case study is the moors in Scotland. So there's heather, which is what grows as kind of a shrub at sort of the midway point of succession. And it's good for sheep, red deer, cattle, red grouse, all of these to eat and be a habitat for. And obviously a lot of farmers and people who own land up there would like to keep it that way. So using periodic burning helps to create young, nutritious growth for grazing animals. So by taking back down to allow secondary succession to occur and bring back new heather, it sort of allows that. And then they do leave some areas where they let that tall, woody heather be left because it's suitable for nesting birds. But ultimately, this kind of use of grazing and controlled burning stops the moorland from completing succession. So enough is burned that we get new secondary succession happening, and we don't let it go all the way to the Climax community, because, as I said, in sort of northern Scotland, that would be like a big spruce pine forest. So it'd be dense, thick forest, which wouldn't be good for any of those animals and would be obviously very difficult to manage. So we stop that from happening, and that conserves this environment and the heather, which would disappear if you let the forest sort of get to a point where it would be the Climax community of forests. Okay, so that is succession. You need to know how to know the steps of primary and secondary succession, be able to say what that difference is between those two, be able to give examples of pioneer species and sort of the reasons why it allows and improves those abiotic conditions for the next species and so on. Mostly about increasing soil by decaying and increasing nutrients and increasing water, etc. And then you also need to be able to think about and talk about human impacts of succession, which links into conservation, which is the next topic we're going to look at, and be able to think about why we might want to control succession and ways of doing it.
Another specific example of succession is on sand dunes. So the interesting thing about sand dunes is because they're constantly being built up from the ocean, you can actually see all of the stages of succession all at once, so all in the same place. So they're all visible from the early kind of build-up of like fresh new sand that's being deposited by the ocean, all the way up into the old sand dunes a bit further back from the beach where you're going to have larger shrubs. And this is where you can kind of see as you go up and walk across the dunes away from the sea, you can actually see this kind of change and then increase in species up until the climax community. If this was left for a really long period of time without change or intervention by humans, then obviously eventually it could become grassland and then woodland. And obviously as you get further away from the ocean, that's what would have happened. A lot of the sand dunes is still a changing environment, and a lot of it is still kind of affected by humans, because obviously around beaches is a lot of where human activity takes place. But in theory, if you left sort of further away from the sea a sand dune for long enough, it could potentially turn from grassland to woodland. So some examples of the pioneer species that start on the early sand are sea rocket and prickly sandwort. These can tolerate the high salinity, so the high saltwater spray that's coming off the ocean, and they are able to cope with the instability of the shifting sand because it's still quite movable at this point. It's not kind of very compacted, and so they can cope with that with their roots. Because we have these plants then here, the mini sand dunes start to form around the base of the plants because their roots help to try and trap some of that sand. As this sand then gets a bit deeper, we have sea sandwort and sea couchgrass which colonise, and they help to stabilise the sand even further. As we get these more plants colonising, we get more stability from their long roots and also more nutrients from them dying and decaying. This allows plants like sea spurge and marram grass to then colonise. These help trap more sand and what increases the sand dunes again. So this is why we get kind of a slope going up away from the beach. Finally, we get colonisation by leguminous plants, which are going to increase the amount of nitrates in the soil, so they enrich it, make it more nutrient rich, so that then other larger plants can colonise. These would be things like bird's foot trefoil, which we know is a leguminous plant, and then eventually that allows larger plants like sand fescue finally form the climax community.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.